Nazis' ideology of hatred and superiority. The Nazis' ideology of hatred and superiority was rooted in the belief that the German people were a master race, and that Jews and other non-Aryans were inferior. This belief was used to justify the systematic murder of 6 million Jews during the Holocaust. The Nazis believed that the Jews were a threat to the German people and their way of life, and that they had to be eliminated in order to preserve the purity of the German race. This ideology of hatred and superiority was used to justify the horrific acts of violence and persecution that were carried out against the Jews during the Holocaust. The Nazi ideology was also used to justify their policies of racial segregation and discrimination. Jews were denied basic rights and privileges, and were forced to live in ghettos, where they were subjected to harsh living conditions and inhumane treatment. The Nazis also used propaganda to spread their hateful message, and to encourage people to support their policies. Anti-Semitism in Germany and Europe before the Holocaust. The roots of anti-Semitism in Europe can be traced back to the Middle Ages, when Jews were persecuted and accused of being responsible for the death of Jesus. This sentiment was further entrenched in the 19th century, when the rise of nationalism and the spread of racial theories saw Jews become scapegoats for the social and economic problems of the time. This was particularly true in Germany, where the Nazi Party used anti-Semitism as a tool to gain power and consolidate their rule. Without evidence, they blamed Jewish Germans for the country's loss during the First World War. The Nazi Party's anti-Semitic policies were not limited to Germany, however, and were adopted by other European countries, such as Poland and Hungary. As a result, Jews throughout Europe were subjected to discrimination, violence, and ultimately, systematic murder during the Holocaust. Kristallnacht. Kristallnacht, also known as the Night of Broken Glass, was a pogrom against Jews throughout Nazi Germany and Austria on November 9 and 10, 1938. The name comes from the broken glass that littered the streets after Jewish-owned businesses, synagogues, and homes were vandalized and destroyed by members of the Sturmabteilung, SA, a paramilitary organization that served as the Nazi Party's original paramilitary wing. Image with caption, "Broken shop windows of Jewish-owned businesses." The SA, led by Victor Lutz, and previously Ernst Röhm, played a key role in the violence of Kristallnacht. They were given free rein to attack Jewish-owned businesses and synagogues, while the police and fire departments were ordered not to intervene. Thousands of Jewish-owned businesses were destroyed, and many Jewish men were arrested and sent to concentration camps. The pogrom was a turning point for the Nazi regime, as it marked a significant escalation in their persecution of Jews. The international community was shocked by the events of Kristallnacht, but little was done to intervene. Creation of the ghettos. Once the war commenced, the Nazis pursued total annihilation of the Jewish people, both at home in Germany and in newly occupied territories such as Poland and Hungary. The systematic murder began with the creation of the ghettos. These were areas of cities, towns and villages that were designated for Jews to live in and were often surrounded by walls. The ghettos were overcrowded, with little food, sanitation or medical care. Jews were forced to live in these conditions, and were not allowed to leave unless they had a special permit. This was the first step in the Nazi plan to isolate Jews from the rest of society. The ghettos were also used as a form of control. Jews were forced to wear a yellow star on their clothing and were subject to random searches and arrests. They were also subjected to forced labor, and were often used as a source of slave labor for the Nazi war effort. The ghettos were also used as a way to identify Jews for deportation to concentration camps. The killing machines. The ghettos that Jews were forced into were just the first step in a calculated process of genocide by the Nazis. From 1941 onwards, the Nazis, in collaboration with the national governments of occupied countries, moved the Jewish population out of the ghettos and into concentration camps. These camps were designed to be efficient killing machines, with the sole purpose of exterminating as many Jews as possible. The camps were designed to be self-contained, with the Jews having no access to the outside world. Inside the camps, the Jews were subjected to harsh conditions, with overcrowding, malnutrition, and disease rampant. The Nazis employed a variety of methods to kill the Jews, including gas chambers, firing squads, and medical experiments. The Jews were also used as slave labor, with many of them dying from exhaustion and overwork. The Nazis also used the camps to carry out their racial policies, such as the forced sterilization of Jews and other minorities. The most notorious of these camps was Auschwitz-Birkenau, a huge complex designed to be an industrial killing machine. The camp was built for mass extermination, and at its peak in 1944, 20,000 men, women and children were being murdered there every day. The victims of the Holocaust: Jews, Romani people, homosexuals, and others. The Holocaust was a systematic and calculated attempt primarily to eradicate the Jewish population of Europe. However, The Nazis also targeted other minority groups, including the Romani people, homosexuals, and those with disabilities. These victims were subjected to the same horrors as the Jews, including forced labor, starvation, and medical experiments. The Nazis sought to create a society in which they were the only ones in power, and they believed that the elimination of these minority groups was necessary for their vision of a perfect society. The Nazis used propaganda to dehumanize their victims and to justify their actions. They also used terror tactics to instill fear in those who opposed them. The Holocaust was a tragedy of immense proportions, and its effects are still felt today. Bystanders, those who did and did not act. The role of bystanders was crucial in the Holocaust. Those who did not act, either out of fear or apathy, allowed the Nazis to carry out their horrific plans. Bystanders who did take action, however, were often met with resistance from the Nazi regime. Many risked their lives to help Jews escape or hide, and some even joined the resistance movement. This sometimes involved the creation of secret rooms within houses and shops. The inaction of bystanders was particularly devastating in countries occupied by the Nazis. In some cases, citizens were complicit in the persecution of Jews, either through direct participation or by remaining silent. In other cases, people were unaware of the atrocities taking place, or were too afraid to speak out. Stories of resistance, the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising and other acts of defiance. The Warsaw Ghetto Uprising of 1943 is one of the most well-known acts of resistance against the Nazi regime during the Holocaust. The Jews of the Warsaw Ghetto, led by the Jewish Fighting Organization, rose up against the Nazi forces in a desperate attempt to fight for their freedom. Despite being heavily outnumbered and outgunned, the Jews of the Warsaw Ghetto managed to hold off the Nazis for nearly a month, with German forces having to burn the district block by block. The uprising was ultimately unsuccessful, but it served as a powerful symbol of Jewish resistance in the face of overwhelming odds. Even though Jewish leaders knew they couldn't win, they were inspired by a desire not to allow the Germans alone to pick the time and place of our deaths. The Warsaw Ghetto Uprising was not the only act of defiance against the Nazi regime during the Holocaust. Jews in ghettos and concentration camps across Europe staged uprisings, engaged in sabotage, and even formed underground networks to help smuggle Jews out of Nazi-occupied territories. These acts of resistance, while often unsuccessful, provided a glimmer of hope in an otherwise bleak situation. Liberation, the end of the Holocaust and the liberation of the concentration camps. The liberation of the concentration camps marked the end of the Holocaust and the systematic murder of 6 million Jews. The Allies, who had been fighting the Nazis since the beginning of World War II, were finally able to enter the camps and free the prisoners. The shock of what they found was immense. The prisoners were in a state of extreme starvation and exhaustion, and the camps were filled with the corpses of those who had been killed by the Nazis. The Allies were determined to bring justice to those responsible for the Holocaust and to ensure that the victims were given the care and respect they deserved. The liberation of the concentration camps was a moment of joy and relief for the survivors, but it was also a time of mourning. The survivors had lost family and friends, and the horrors of the Holocaust would remain with them for the rest of their lives. As the Allies worked to rebuild Europe, they also sought to ensure that the memory of the Holocaust would never be forgotten. Memorials were built, and the stories of the survivors were shared to ensure that the world would never forget the tragedy of the Holocaust. Coming to terms with the Holocaust, trials, memorials, and the ongoing search for justice. The Holocaust was a tragedy of unfathomable proportions. It was a systematic, premeditated attempt to exterminate an entire people, and its effects are still felt today. In the aftermath of the war, the world was left to grapple with the enormity of the crime. The Nuremberg trials were a crucial step in coming to terms with the Holocaust, as they provided an opportunity to bring the perpetrators to justice. The trials also served as a reminder of the importance of holding those in power accountable for their actions. In the decades since the Holocaust, memorials have been erected around the world to honor the victims. These memorials are a reminder of the immense suffering endured by the Jewish people, and of the need to prevent such atrocities from ever happening again. The search for justice continues, as survivors and their families seek to bring those responsible for the Holocaust to justice. The Holocaust serves as a reminder of the importance of standing up for justice and human rights, and of the need to never forget the horrors of the past. The impact on the Holocaust on the formation of Israel after the Second World War. The Holocaust had a profound impact on the formation of the State of Israel. The genocide, perhaps the most evil and unconscionable act in human history, was a stark reminder of the dangers of anti-Semitism, and the need for a safe haven for Jews. The survivors of the Holocaust, many of whom had lost family and friends, were determined to create a Jewish state. The United Nations voted in favor of the establishment of Israel in 1947. The establishment of Israel was a major milestone in the history of the Jewish people. It was a symbol of hope and resilience, and a reminder of the horrors of the Holocaust. It was also a reminder of the importance of standing up to anti-Semitism and intolerance. Israel became instrumental in hunting down runaway architects of the Holocaust, including Adolf Eichmann. The U.S. enters the Pacific War, Pearl Harbor and the Doolittle Raid. The U.S. entry into the Pacific War was marked by the surprise attack on Pearl Harbor, Hawaii, on December 7, 1941. They did so without declaring war first, which was seen to be a violation of the laws of war, and did so as a preventative measure because they thought the U.S. would interfere with their imperial ambitions in the Pacific. The attack was a devastating blow to the U.S. Pacific Fleet, damaging all 8 of their ships and sinking 4. In response, the U.S. declared war and launched the Doolittle Raid, a daring air raid on Tokyo and other Japanese cities. The raid was a show of strength and a demonstration of the U.S.'s ability to strike back, and served as the first American offensive of the war. The U.S. was also eventually able to get all but one of their ships back to being operational. Battle of Midway, a turning point in the Pacific War. The Battle of Midway was a decisive turning point in the Pacific War. In June 1942, the Japanese Navy had planned a major offensive against the U.S. naval base at Midway Island. The Japanese hoped to draw the U.S. fleet into a decisive battle using a complicated plan that involved 3 different fleets converging simultaneously so they could destroy their fleet once and for all. However, unbeknownst to Japanese Admiral Yamamoto, the U.S. had broken parts of Japanese naval code and were able to anticipate the attack and launch a surprise counterattack. The U.S. Navy inflicted heavy losses on the Japanese, sinking 4 aircraft carriers and a heavy cruiser as part of their first major naval victory of the Second World War. The Japanese Navy was forced to retreat and the U.S. Navy gained the upper hand in the Pacific War. Island hopping, the American strategy to retake the Pacific. The United States strategy to retake the Pacific during World War II was known as island hopping. This strategy involved the U.S. military bypassing heavily defended Japanese-held islands and instead focusing on capturing strategically important islands. They would then cut off the supply chains of those well-defended islands to stop them from getting food and reinforcements. This allowed the U.S. to slowly advance towards Japan while avoiding costly decisive battles. However, the islands that were captured were not spared from the brutality of war. U.S. forces engaged in fierce battles with Japanese troops, often resulting in high casualties on both sides. The island hopping campaign was a long and difficult process, but ultimately it was successful in leading the U.S. to victory in the Pacific. Bloody Guadalcanal, the first major U.S. offensive in the Pacific theater. The U.S. and Japan engaged in a brutal island hopping campaign in the Pacific theater. The first major U.S. offensive was the Battle of Guadalcanal, which began in August 1942. This campaign was the first major Allied offensive against the Japanese in the Pacific, and it was a long and bloody affair. Guadalcanal, an island in the Solomon Islands, was strategically important because Japan was building an airfield on it. The U.S. forces faced a determined Japanese defense, and the fighting was fierce. The battle lasted for months, and the U.S. suffered heavy casualties. In the end, the U.S. forces were victorious, and this victory was a turning point in the war in the Pacific. The U.S. forces had demonstrated their ability to fight and win against the Japanese, and this victory was a major boost to Allied morale, setting the stage for further Allied advances in the Pacific theater. Battle of the Philippine Sea, the largest naval battle of World War II. The Battle of the Philippine Sea was a decisive moment in the Pacific theater of World War II. The battle began on June 19, 1944, when the U.S. Navy launched a massive air attack against the Japanese fleet. They did this as part of an effort to gain control of the Marianas, which would put them within strategic bombing range of Japan itself. Japan deemed this to be too potentially destructive for morale and thus tried to provoke a decisive battle. However, largely due to the inexperience of Japan's aircraft pilots, the U.S. had a significant aerial advantage. The U.S. forces managed to sink 2 Japanese aircraft carriers and severely damage others, while the Japanese only managed to sink 1 U.S. carrier. This was a major turning point in the war, as the U.S. had gained the ability to threaten Japan directly. In the Philippines, MacArthur's triumph, including an explanation of the island hopping strategy. The U.S. and Japan engaged in a brutal island hopping campaign during World War II. This strategy was used by the U.S. to gain control of the Pacific Ocean and ultimately defeat the Japanese. The campaign began with the liberation of the Philippines, a key strategic point in the Pacific. General Douglas MacArthur, who had been forced to flee the Philippines in 1942, was determined to return and liberate the islands. He led a successful campaign to retake the islands, beginning with the Battle of Leyte Gulf in October 1944. This was followed by a series of amphibious landings and island-hopping campaigns, which saw the U.S. forces take control of strategic islands and cut off Japanese supply lines. The campaign was brutal and costly for both sides, but ultimately the U.S. was able to gain control of the Pacific and defeat the Japanese. The island-hopping strategy was a key factor in the U.S. victory in the Pacific theater. Iwo Jima and Okinawa, the bloodiest battles of the Pacific War. As the U.S. advanced, Japanese guerrilla defense tactics became increasingly desperate, with forces refusing to surrender even when heavily outnumbered. The Battle of Iwo Jima was one of the most costly battles of the Pacific War. The American Marines, led by General Holland Smith, faced a fierce defense from the Japanese forces, who had entrenched themselves in the island's caves and over 11 miles of tunnels. Despite the U.S. forces' superior firepower, the battle dragged on for 5 weeks, with the Americans suffering over 25,000 casualties. The Japanese forces, meanwhile, suffered a staggering loss of nearly 20,000 men. The Battle of Okinawa was even more devastating. The U.S. forces, led by General Simon Bolivar Buckner, faced a determined defense from the Japanese forces, who had fortified the island with a network of bunkers and artillery. The battle lasted for 3 months, with the Americans suffering over 50,000 casualties and the Japanese forces suffering over 100,000 casualties. The battle was one of the bloodiest of the Pacific War, and its consequences were felt for decades afterwards. Bombing of Tokyo, a devastating new tactic. The US and Japan engaged in a brutal island-hopping campaign during World War II. After the Battle of the Philippine Sea, the US had a new tactic at their disposal: the strategic firebombing of Tokyo. On the night of March 9, 1945, the US launched a massive air raid on Tokyo, dropping over 1,500 tons of incendiary bombs. The resulting firestorm destroyed an estimated 16 square miles of the city, killing over 100,000 people. This was the first of many such raids, and the Japanese cities of Kobe, Osaka, and Nagoya were also subjected to similar attacks. The firebombing of Tokyo was a major turning point in the war, as it demonstrated the devastating power of aerial bombardment and the ability to inflict massive casualties on civilian populations. It also clearly demonstrated that Japan had changed from an offensive to a defensive player in the war. Manhattan Project and the development of the atomic bomb. The Manhattan Project was a top-secret research and development program that was initiated by the United States in 1942. Its goal was to develop the world's first atomic bomb. The project was led by a team of scientists, engineers, and military personnel, and it was funded by the U.S. government. The project was successful and the first atomic bomb was tested in July 1945. The bomb was then used to devastating effect against the Japanese cities of Hiroshima and Nagasaki in August 1945, leading to the end of World War II. The development of the atomic bomb was a major turning point in the Pacific theater, and it had a profound impact on the course of the war. The development of the atomic bomb also ushered in a new era of warfare, one in which the use of nuclear weapons was a real possibility. Atomic bombs: the United States drops 2 nuclear weapons on Japan. The United States' decision to drop 2 atomic bombs on Japan in 1945 was a devastating and controversial move. The bombs, dropped on the cities of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, killed over 150,000 people and marked the beginning of the atomic age. The decision to use the bombs was a result of the prolonged and brutal island-hopping campaign that had been waged by the US and Japan in the Pacific. The campaign had been characterized by heavy casualties on both sides, and the US hoped that the atomic bombs would bring a swift end to the war. The bombs did indeed bring an end to the war, but the destruction and loss of life caused by the bombs has been a source of debate ever since. For invasion, the months leading up to D-Day. In the months leading up to D-Day, the Allies were hard at work preparing for the invasion of Nazi-occupied France. The first step was to build up a massive armada of ships, planes, and troops. This was no small feat, as the Allies had to coordinate the efforts of multiple nations, each with their own resources and capabilities. In addition, the Allies had to make sure that their plans were kept secret, as any hint of their intentions would give the Nazis an advantage. The Allies also had to plan for the logistics of the invasion, such as where the troops would land and how they would move inland. This was complicated by the fact that the Nazis had fortified the French coastline with a network of bunkers and other defensive structures. To counter this, the Allies had to develop new tactics and strategies to ensure a successful invasion. In the end, the Allies' meticulous planning paid off, and on June 6, 1944, the long-awaited invasion of Nazi-occupied France began. Logistics and planning: the complexities of organizing the largest amphibious invasion in history. The logistical complexities of organizing the largest amphibious invasion in history were immense. The Allies had to consider the weather conditions and the tides, as these would have a major impact on the success of the invasion. To ensure the best chances of success, they had to choose the right time and location for the landings. Initially, General Eisenhower had selected the 5th June for the invasion, but the weather was too poor, so it was delayed by a day. The Allies also had to consider the terrain of the beaches and the fortifications of the German defenses. Calais would have been the most logical place to attack because it has the shortest nautical distance from England, but Germany, recognizing this fact, fortified it heavily. Landings were also considered in Brittany, but as it is a peninsula, it was thought that it would be too easy for Germany to cut off the Allies. As a result, Normandy was selected as the final location for the landings. Operation Bodyguard, Distraction and Subterfuge before D-Day. The Allies had been planning for the invasion of Nazi-occupied France for some time, and the success of the mission was of the utmost importance. In order to ensure success, the Allies had to make sure that the Nazis were unaware of the impending invasion. To this end, the Allies devised Operation Bodyguard, a plan to distract and deceive the Nazis. The Allies used a variety of tactics to keep the Nazis in the dark. They spread rumors of potential landings in other parts of Europe, and they even staged a fake invasion in the Mediterranean. They also used double agents and false radio transmissions to further confuse the Nazis. Finally, they created inflatable tanks in Salisbury Plain to deceive German aerial reconnaissance. All of these tactics worked together to create a smokescreen that kept the Nazis from realizing the true nature of the Allies' plans. In the end, Operation Bodyguard was a success, and the Allies were able to launch their invasion of France with the element of surprise. Operation Neptune, the naval component of D-Day. The Allies' naval forces played a critical role in the success of D-Day. Operation Neptune was the code name for the naval component of the invasion. It was the largest amphibious operation in history, involving over 5,000 ships and landing craft. The naval forces provided support to the troops on the beaches, transporting them to the coast of France and providing cover from enemy fire. They also provided a shield against German submarines and mines. The Allies' naval forces were divided into two groups. The first group was the Western Naval Task Force, which was responsible for the landings in Normandy. The second group was the Eastern Naval Task Force, which was responsible for the landings in southern France. Both groups were made up of ships from the United States, Britain, Canada, and other Allied nations. The naval forces were essential in providing the troops with the supplies and support they needed to complete the mission. Without them, the success of D-Day would not have been possible. Storming the beaches, the Allies make landfall in Normandy. On June 6, 1944, the Allies made their long-awaited invasion of Nazi-occupied France. Codenamed Operation Overlord, the Allied forces had been preparing for months for the momentous event. The Allies had assembled a massive armada of ships, planes, and soldiers to launch a surprise attack on the beaches of Normandy. The Allies had to overcome a number of obstacles to make landfall. The Germans had constructed a series of formidable fortifications along the coastline, and the Allies had to contend with heavy fire from the German defenders. Despite the danger, the Allied forces managed to establish a foothold on the beaches and began to push inland. The Allies' success on the beaches of Normandy marked a major turning point in the war and paved the way for the liberation of France and the eventual defeat of Nazi Germany. Casualties and chaos, the brutal reality of the invasion. The Allies' invasion of Nazi-occupied France on June 6, 1944, was a long-awaited moment of hope for many. However, the reality of the invasion was far from the glory and victory that had been anticipated. The Allies suffered heavy casualties, with an estimated 10,000 killed or wounded on the first day alone, a far higher casualty figure than amongst the entrenched German defenders. The brutality of the invasion was further highlighted by the fact that the Allies had to fight their way through heavily fortified positions. This meant that the Allies had to use a great deal of firepower to break through the German defenses, resulting in the destruction of many towns and villages in the area. The Allies also had to contend with the fact that the Germans had mined the beaches, making the invasion even more hazardous. Airborne assault. Paratroopers play a crucial role in securing inland objectives. The Allies' plan of attack for D-Day was a complex one, involving a variety of forces. One of the most important of these was the airborne assault, which saw thousands of paratroopers dropped into Nazi-occupied France. Their mission was to secure inland objectives, such as bridges and roads, to ensure the success and momentum of the main invasion force. This was a risky and dangerous mission, as the paratroopers were often dropped into hostile territory and had to fight their way to their objectives. The success of the airborne assault was crucial to the success of the invasion. The paratroopers were able to secure key objectives, allowing the main invasion force to advance quickly and disrupt German supply and reinforcement infrastructure. Their bravery and skill in the face of enemy fire was a major factor in the Allies' eventual victory on D-Day. Breaking through, the Allies established a foothold in France. The Allies had been planning for the invasion of Nazi-occupied France for months, and on June 6, 1944, the long-awaited D-Day finally arrived. The Allies had to break through the German defenses in order to establish a foothold in France. The invasion was a massive undertaking, involving over 150,000 troops, 200,000 naval personnel, and 11,000 aircraft. The Allies were able to land on 5 beaches in Normandy, and by the end of the day, they had established a beachhead. However, they weren't able to connect their 5 beachheads until a week after the initial invasion. The Allies' success on D-Day was a major turning point in the war. The invasion of France was a huge risk, but it paid off. The Allies were able to establish a foothold in France, and this was the beginning of the end for Nazi Germany. The Allies were able to push forward and liberate France from Nazi occupation, creating a new front for the Germans to dedicate resources to. German counterattacks, the struggle to maintain control. The Allies' invasion of Nazi-occupied France was met with fierce resistance from the German forces. In the days following the initial landings, the Germans launched several counterattacks in an attempt to regain control of the region. Despite the ferocity of their efforts, the Allies were able to hold their ground and eventually push the Germans back. The Allies' success in repelling the German counterattacks was due in part to the superior training and equipment of their troops. The Allies had been preparing for the invasion for months, while the Germans had been spread thin by prolonged conflict with the USSR on the Eastern Front and lacked the resources to mount a successful defense. The Allies' superior air power also played a role, as they were able to launch devastating airstrikes against the German positions. In the end, the Allies were able to maintain control of the region and continue their advance into France. Falaise Pocket, the Allies trap and destroy the German 7th Army. The Allies' long-awaited invasion of Nazi-occupied France was a major turning point in World War II. One of the most important events of the invasion was the Falaise Pocket in August 1944, where the Allies trapped and destroyed the German 7th Army. The Allies had been planning the invasion of France for months, and they had the advantage of air superiority. This allowed them to launch a massive bombing campaign against the German forces. The Allies also had the advantage of surprise, as the Germans were expecting a landing further north. The Allies were able to quickly cut off the German 7th Army, trapping them in the Falaise Pocket. The Germans were unable to escape, and the Allies were able to destroy the 7th Army, dealing a major blow to the Nazi forces. This was a major victory for the Allies, and it helped to turn the tide of the war in their favor. Aftermath of D-Day, how the invasion changed the course of the war. The Allied invasion of Nazi-occupied France on June 6, 1944, marked a major turning point in the war. The success of the invasion meant that the Allies were now able to launch a full-scale attack on the Nazis, and the liberation of Europe had begun. The Allies were able to push the Nazis back, and soon the tide of the war had shifted in their favor. The consequences of the invasion were far-reaching. The liberation of Europe meant that the Nazis were no longer able to continue their reign of terror, and the Allies were able to gain a foothold in the continent. This allowed them to launch a full-scale offensive against the Nazis, and eventually, the war was won. The success of the invasion of France was a major factor in the Allies' victory, and it changed the course of the war in a dramatic way.